Five Nights at Freddy's is without a doubt one of the most recognizable gaming franchises in recent time. There was a point in time where the FNAF series had dominated all indie horror games. It was played by some of the biggest names on YouTube. And for the vast majority of people, we all remember the days when FNAF was deemed the scariest game of all time, mainly for its raw, isolation, eccentric, real-life horror feeling, which was something that has set the game apart from other horror games at the time. But looking back at old FNAF games and looking at present-day FNAF games, you have to ask yourself, how did the series go from being called one of the scariest games of all time, while having some of the most dedicated fan bases, to now a game looks like a cartoon fandom game that isn't fun, scary, and is very unplayable to people? Well, in this video, we're going to be going through FNAF's history from the ground up, to see if we can find where the series started spiraling out of control. This is the rise and fall of one of the greatest gaming franchises of all time, Five Nights at Freddy's. So if you want to look at FNAF's history, we have to go way back. And I mean way back. Early 1990s. Because during this time, there was an unknown to the world 16-year-old kid in Houston, Texas by the name of Cawthon who began developing video games in his house. And in the early stages, Scott's games that he began making weren't too significant, as Scott didn't have much to work with besides his programming skills and his computer. Some of his early games that he made in the 90s were Dofus, Floppy Disk, RPG Max, and a dozen other more games. But there was one problem. By 2013, when Scott was 35 years old, Scott had already released over 70 different games in that time span, and all of his games that he created never gained any sort of traction. And in fact, the people who did discover Scott's games all said that they sucked and weren't any good, which was a bit of a blow to Scott since he already made a bunch of different games, as Scott had already been creating video games for about 20 years from when he was a teenager, only to get no positive feedback. And for the average person, that would just be a sign to throw in the towel and move on to something else. But Scott didn't do that, as he was still passionate about creating games, and just needed to make the right kind of game that would be able to grab people's attention. More so, he needed to shift away from making games that had no meaning to one another, and needed to focus on a niche that a lot of people would enjoy. That is, of course, horror. He would take his previous game that he released, which was called Chipper & Sons Lumber Company, which released in 2013, and he would take this game as his inspiration for his new project. He took this game as his inspiration because a lot of people often said that the characters in Chipper & Sons Lumber Company looked like unsettling animatronic characters, which we can definitely see. So, Scott Cawthon began getting to work on his new project, and just a couple months later, he would go on to release his brand new official gameplay footage for his new game on his YouTube channel in 2013, which his new game was called Five Nights at Freddy's. Scott would then go on to release a demo version of the game on IndieDB on July 23, 2014, but there was still a problem. Up to the release of the demo version of Five Nights at Freddy's, the game was still pretty much unknown to the world, and quite frankly, no one was playing the demo version at all, except for one individual, an individual by the name of Ben the Scoopus, where Scott had actually sent Ben the entire version of the game for him to play, making him the first ever person to play Five Nights at Freddy's. And from here on, 2 weeks later, the game was released to the public on a website called Desur. And just 2 days from when the game was released, it instantly blew up when a fairly well-known creator at the time by the name of YummyMash would go on to post his own FNAF walkthrough, where YummyMash was pretty much the first ever YouTuber to play the game. And this quite seemed to work in the game's favor, because YummyMash's video garnered Five Nights at Freddy's a lot of traction, as his viewers decided to start playing the game as it seemed super appealing to them. And not long after YummyMash's video came out, 2 days later, Markiplier, who had around 2 million subscribers at the time, then decided to make his own FNAF walkthrough. And it's safe to say that this was pretty much where a majority of FNAF fans all discovered the game. Perfect! No! Fucking fuck! When Markiplier played through FNAF, millions of people became eager to play the game. And the funny thing was that FNAF became an instant hit before it was even released onto Steam, which is where a majority of PC gamers play on. And it only makes sense to have the game put up on one of the biggest PC gaming sites for more people to play. And just 8 days later from when Markiplier played through FNAF for the first time, the game was officially greenlit to making it playable on Steam, which only made it more accessible to the rest of the world to play. And from here on, the game was officially getting played by every single gaming YouTuber. People like PewDiePie, CoryXKenshin, Jacksepticeye, Critical, and a boatload of more creators. The main reason why FNAF appealed to many people is because of the game's different kind of horror feeling. In most horror games, the players are often trying to run away from something in the game, and they're essentially trying to find their way out. But FNAF was the complete opposite of that. Instead, the players locked in one spot where they are basically defenseless, and jump scares were an eccentric part of the game, which was an aspect of the game that people fairly enjoyed, getting caught off guard when you think you're safe only to be jump scared out of nowhere. Throughout the first Five Nights at Freddy's game, a lot of things began popping up, like FNAF songs, Five Nights at Freddy's animations, which are things that have become a huge iconic part in gaming history, and also a Five Nights at Freddy's Reddit page, where it was basically a place where the community would all come together to interact, come up with theories with each other, and post fan art. Another aspect of Five Nights at Freddy's that the community loved was that fans felt like the game had a reimagination of Chuck E. Cheese, as the game had a pizzeria restaurant setting with animatronics that were programmed to hunt the player down. For the most part, the game was doing fairly well for only being created by one person, but Scott did just want to create a one-hit success game and vanish. Instead, he would go on to post a sequel just weeks later on his website, Five Nights at Freddy's 2: The Grand Reopening. This has surprised many fans, as the first Five Nights at Freddy's game wasn't even a month old yet, and there was already a new FNAF game in development. The set release date was going to be in 2015, and this got many fans excited, as they all now realized that Five Nights at Freddy's was to become a game series. Scott would continue to release a multitude of teasers on his website, more so directed to the animatronics in the game, as people thought that the animatronics were going to go from their dim, rundown look to a toy version that was still quite creepy to look at. He would also show how the gameplay of the game looked and operated, and it was fair to say that fans were building huge anticipation for the release. And finally, the official Five Nights at Freddy's 2 trailer released in late October of 2014, which was considered even more scary, since in the first Five Nights at Freddy's game, there were doors where the player could close to feel safe, but now in the second installment, there were no doors and you quite literally had no protection. Then sometime later, Scott would go on to change the release date from 2015 to November of 2014, which only boosted the game's hype even more, as it's very rare to see two games get released in the same year. And to build even more anticipation for the release, Scott would go on to give Markiplier and more bigger gaming YouTubers access to the demo version of the game early, and when Markiplier posted his first FNAF 2 walkthrough, before anyone else could play it, his video instantly blew up and fans were eager to get their hands on it. But right after Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was officially released to the public on November 11, 2014, 2 days later, Scott Cawthon's website Scott Games went silent, as the only thing on his website was a black screen saying offline. Scott didn't release any new info on his website, and FNAF fans were confused and concerned that there was something wrong. But this was far from the case, because in the bottom left of the screen, when the images brighten up, it says until next time. And when the site was then updated a month later, this time there was a number 3 on the screen, showing signs that there was a third installment of FNAF coming. Shortly after this little teaser, on January 2nd, 2015, ScottGames.com was updated with a brand new teaser with a picture of a brand new animatronic with text saying "I am still here." Many fans didn't know what to make of this since, well, they didn't know who this animatronic was. 2 weeks later, Scott would then post another teaser on his website, but this time it gave more sense of how the third installment of the game was gonna be like. On January 26, 2015, the official Five Nights at Freddy's 3 trailer was posted, which caused millions of people to tune into. And when the game officially released, fans were very impressed with the game itself, since compared to the previous 2 FNAF games, FNAF 3 had a lot of gameplay features that made the game itself more scary and stressful for the player, which many fans found amazing. And after Five Nights at Freddy's 3, people didn't know if Scott was going to make another FNAF game, since he had already pumped out 3 FNAF games in less than a year. But a month later, Scott would not just stop there, as on ScottGames.com, he would post a teaser for, well, the 4th installment of the series, which in the teaser, we can tell that Scott was really going for a more horror and scary look, since in the teaser, Scott had named Freddy Nightmare Freddy, and ironically enough, the set release date was going to be on Halloween of that year. When we look at back old FNAF games, we all notice just how well Scott made them. In FNAF 1, the player was stuck in an office. In FNAF 2, the player was in a big office with virtually no protection. In FNAF 3, there were multiple tasks that the player had to do while also making sure the animatronics couldn't kill them. And in FNAF 4, the game was set in a house. Scott's always shared them up a bit, with it still feeling like a Five Nights at Freddy's game, and not some off-the-rails futuristic type game. It was safe to say that the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise was dominating all indie horror games, and the community was loving it. Over the following years, Scott had released dozens of more FNAF games: FNAF World, Sister Location, Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, and FNAF Custom Night, which after Five Nights at Freddy's Custom Nights, this was the 7th installment of the series, and most people, including myself, all assumed that this is where the franchise was gonna end, as it only seemed appropriate. The game was basically taking all of the FNAF games and mashing them all together as a sort of thank you letter from the community. But as for the series coming to an end, this was far from the truth, as Scott didn't exactly have plans for the game coming to an end. To people's surprise, in March of 2019, a new teaser for a new FNAF game would be made public, Five Nights at Freddy's Help Wanted VR. And for once, the game was not created by Scott, but instead created by a gaming company called Steel Wool Studios. And for the first time in the game series, this would be the first of many FNAF games where the community didn't like it. Fans feel like Help Wanted was just not as good as the previous FNAF games, and probably the biggest complaint from fans is that people said the game just didn't feel scary. People felt like the jump scares of the game were just lackluster and weren't as good as they were before, which is a pretty huge element of the game. I mean, after all, the game was built upon jump scares and catching the player off guard. This was oppressive to the point where people began saying how the jump scares started to feel super repetitive. For me, it isn't. I knew how the game works, so I didn't get jump scared often, and you often know when you're gonna die so you can brace yourself. The jump scares aren't at all scary to me either. But not saying that the entire game itself is bad, because after all, the game is basically targeted for VR, and therefore it wouldn't exactly be fair to compare a VR game to other games. However, these problems that the community would express wouldn't even compel to the complaints that would arise later on. On August 27th, 2020, Cawthon was going to make a post on the FNAF Reddit page announcing that he would be partnering up with FNAF to remake the original Five Nights at Freddy's game. This got people's hopes up, as it sounded like it was going to be a more detailed and better version of the first Five Nights at Freddy's game. This seemed incredibly enticing, and over the next 2 years, FNAF would post films on the official FNAF Plus channel, which were very similar to the original FNAF game. They would show off how the gameplay looked, and even showed off how the map looked. Then in August of 2022, the official Five Nights at Freddy's Plus trailer was released, which people were hyped, and it seemed like FNAF Plus was about ready to be released for people to play, and people were expecting this game to make up for the previous FNAF game that was released 6 months prior, which was deemed the worst FNAF game ever made, that being Security Breach. For some needed context, Security Breach was said to be the canon ending of the FNAF series, as this was the 9th game of the franchise, and when trailers began coming out, it got people excited, since it was one of the most detailed games of the series, it had fantastic graphics, and visually overall, had amazing characters that got people's hopes up. It looked like this game had a lot of potential and had everyone excited for it, but after several delays, when the game launched, it was very disappointing to fans.
However, there is a major element of this game that makes it go from not the best FNAF game to basically irredeemable garbage.
There were many elements of Security Breach that many fans hated, one being that the story of the game made absolutely no sense, the game's extremely buggy problems that made it feel almost unplayable to people felt like it was just rushed. In the initial Security Breach trailer, there were many things from trailers and teasers that weren't even implemented to the actual game, and there was just overall a lot of cut content from the developers. And another aspect we already mentioned before was that the problem with Security Breach was it was just not scary. This was due to the game being super colorful and having all these different kind of sound effects that almost makes the game feel like a children's game. From the animatronics not looking scary, the thing that made FNAF explode for its eccentric real-life horror feeling was the fact that the game was almost meant to feel like a children's game. But it had a dark, dimly look, the animatronics looked creepy, the atmosphere of the game felt creepy, and it overall made it for an eerie feeling, which was something that set FNAF apart from other horror games during the time. But in Security Breach, that feeling was almost completely taken away for its glamorous, colorful look that makes it completely not scary. And if the game is not scary, then what's the point of trying to push it as a scary game when it looks like a kid's game? I can't help but feel this game caters more to children. I find there's a lack of gory, unsettling things like the Mission Children's poster and etc. There's a lack of the unsettling feeling, you know? Jump scares are not scary because it's too somewhat predictable, isn't it? But despite the fact that Security Breach was made fun of and called the worst game of the franchise, surely FNAF Plus, the remake version of the original Five Nights at Freddy's, was gonna make up for all of this, right? Well, no. Five Nights at Freddy's Plus has been removed from the Steam store following the termination of its developer's contract with the Fazbear's Fanverse initiative. Wait, what happened to FNAF Plus? Well, as it would turn out, FNAF, the main developer for FNAF Plus, had gotten into a huge controversy when it would turn out that he didn't actually like Five Nights at Freddy's and despised it. And this led to many people calling him out and resulted in FNAF Plus being cancelled and pulled off from Steam. FNAF would eventually go on to make his own response to the situation by giving a side of the story, but there were people who were just still upset that FNAF Plus was removed, because they had already gotten a rather disappointing game and were hoping that this would compensate for Security Breach, but that didn't happen.
Unfortunately, with them out of the way, it only becomes more obvious how pathetically shallow this game is. It just isn't fun, and I think this was a project planning failure more than anything else. You have to design your levels to fit your game. If you design levels and then design a game around it, it's not gonna work.
So that brings us to now. What do you think about it? This kind of stuff is expected. Gaming franchises change for the better or for the worse, and that's something that just happens over time. The main reason why FNAF just isn't the same anymore is because the game's target audience has changed. The game has took a major step back from when it used to be, from like how the game was actually created in an eerie and scary way, to now, well, it's rather super colorful and glamorous look that makes the game and the characters look like cartoon characters, and just the major shift from that eerie feeling that made FNAF explode in popularity. The series should have ended a long time ago, but due to the game evolving, the demographic of the game's popularity changing, what ultimately led to the FNAF series spiraling out of control. But that's all for today's video. If you guys enjoyed this video, then consider subscribing and drop a like if you want to. Go for my Twitter at ScorpionYT. I did get banned. Fuck Elon Musk. But let me know if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see another video on Five Nights at Freddy's, because I did actually enjoy making this video. Surprise, surprise. And I also do apologize for being gone for 2 weeks. I am sorry, and I will be getting back on my normal upload schedule. I'm saying this shit now, but I'll be gone for like a month later on. But no, thanks for the support, Reese. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace out.